All right. I think it's time to get started. Okay. So I hope that everybody who watches this gets a good understanding of not just where I come from, not just my views as a socialist and as a critic of capitalism and all that it entails, but rather that everybody who watches this can fully grasp how to combat everyday experience of being a socialist in an overwhelming capitalist world. Just recently, I started to reread Volume 1 of Das Kapital, right? Or in English, Capital. It is the critique of political economy, right? So it is Marx's entire foundation, laying out the theory of capitalism and how he combats it and critiques it. I think that everybody should at least pick up the book once in their lifetime, once in their exploration of learning what Marxism is and what all it entails. Going further, starting this entire thing off, I want to state a couple of solid premises, right? We need to understand Marxism primarily as a science of not just looking at history, not just looking at the modern world, but looking at social relations, looking at economic relations, economic production. We need to understand Marx and his discovery of certain patterns within economics and socioeconomic systems. Why every economic system varies from the previous one to the modern one, and why every economic system arises, uh, evolves, and inevitably collapses, right? Now, this is a common thing that contemporary Marxists such as Richard Wolff, Aaron Bastani, and others have kind of addressed, right? That capitalism is on the decline, and socialistic relations within social production and social human relations are rising. The natural response to a decaying capitalist mode of production is the rise of socialism, as it is the next step in the liberation of mankind as a whole to inevitably reaching that hypothesis of a stateless, classless, moneyless society. How we go about doing this is important, and understanding that, yes, we have potential for revolutionary change. But revolution entails material phenomenon that must occur, right? These are neither abstract or ideal understandings of the world around us. These are neither utopian or arbitrary notions to be made, but rather the fact that when we look at the mode of production, what all that entails, we have to understand why it takes on the form it does, what exactly it is, and just how important it is, not just to each of our given societies, but to the world and the global and the international society as a whole, right? Humanity is very young in the blink of an eye when it comes to history. All of human history does not encompass all of material history, and that's important to understand because this world that we live in is much older than we recognize it to be. Our interaction with it is only a reflection of our experience of it, right? So, how we interact with the world around us, at least from the materialist standpoint, which is, which is the premise for all of Marxian theory, is that we interact with nature, we interact with the environment, we interact with other human beings, other creatures, and plant life, right? We interact with society, production, and so much more. And we do that all through a, a kind of reflection of what is pre-existing conditions, or rather material conditions. So materialism states, it's very important to understand this, materialism states that reality is mostly consistent of matter. The primary consistent of what reality is the physical material world. And that it is through the physical material world that certain conditions, social conditions, arise from the ever evolving change and transformation of material conditions. So, example, we see this all the time in ecosystems where different creatures will socially interact with one another depending on whether or not there's enough food, enough plant life, enough materials, and weather conditions suited just right for these social interactions of different creatures to be able to work out for the benefit of all. So if there's a wildfire, half the trees and forests are burnt down, obviously the social interaction of the creatures living in that forest is going to change. Where now that trees and the plants that grew on those trees are more scarce, there's going to be a declining population within that ecosystem. How that declining population occurs is based on the social interaction of those creatures, whether or not certain creatures become more hostile and predatory based on the scarcity of food and resources, or whether or not some of them die out from starvation and isolation and uh, and the harmful effects, whether that's harm to their health, to their physical embodiment of health, to their mental embodiment of health, right? So there are social aspects that are all caused from, again, the material of it all. So that's what materialism asserts. Materialism doesn't ignore that ideas exist, that even consciousness is a construct or factor within reality. It simply states that that is secondary to the pre-existing makeup of reality, which is the material. As Marxists, we use this to understand the world around us, and we understand it when we look at certain socioeconomic systems such as slave economy, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. So now that I've kind of explained the premises of what it is that Marxism truly entails, or the way that we need to go about looking at these anti-capitalist arguments and the defending of Marxism as a science of economics, right? Now that I've done this, let's just start off with a couple of basic points, right? Common things that are repeated on social media, um, that are kind of used to tear apart socialism, communism, Marxism, right? But each and every one of these arguments against socialism and Marxism can actually be used against capital. Let's start off with something. Socialism causes homelessness, it causes poverty, it causes death everywhere that it goes, okay? Okay, if you want to look at it that way, I think it's very important that we understand something. One, the very basic the basis in which capitalism exists is based on generalized commodity production. So if capitalism is generalized commodity production, we must understand it through that lens and understand that commodity production entails a, a format for commodity use. If a commodity is not useful, then it is not a commodity. If something that is produced is used for a use value, that use value extending onto exchange of one item to another, so entailing that that use value supersedes to exchange value, then we understand this product, this commodity, as something that can be bought and sold and given in return for something else, usually something of greater worth, right? Greater value. This is the basic transaction that occurs within this commodified economic system. Now, talking about homelessness, poverty, and death, why I mentioned commodity production. Well, commodity production, the way that it's articulated in capitalism, causes capital accumulation, commodity accumulation, and particularly the concentration of both capital and commodities within to a higher and higher class position. Inevitably, meaning that a smaller group of people control a vast majority of all things produced within capitalism. This inevitably creates wealth disparity, which capitalism needs to create a poverty class. As long as capitalism entails the existence of a poverty class, the capitalists themselves always has a reserve army of labor, which always makes you the work replaceable. No matter how wonderful of a worker you are, if you do not reach their standards, no matter how effective, how efficient, how skilled of a laborer you are, if they do not see the immediate profit accumulation of your labor time, they replace you through that army of labor. Because anybody within the poverty class will be willing to take up your job with the lack of knowledge and the lack of skills that is required to perform the job. They will go, they will take that job for the bare minimum wage. This is what is considered to be a form of voluntary exploitation. It is exploitation because at the end of the day, they're they are conditioned, they're systematically required to abide and to contend to whatever gains they can get, despite it not even being livable or even allowing them to be sustainable. Now, death, right? It is important to understand that death is caused from the existence of the poverty class. As long as you have a class that is willing to work for the bare minimum, to where they can barely scrape by and have very little incentive to demand for more, because if they demand for more, and this is why they'd be incentivized to demand for more, because the poverty class, as long as they can barely scrape by, they will always be looking for that little bit to scrape by. If they ever ask for a little bit more, well, the capitalists then start providing. Off to the streets you go. Back into the reserve army of labor you go. There you go. Now you are out of a job, so you can no longer provide yourself health care, education, housing, or even basic necessities, clothes, food, electricity, right? So You have those secondary ones, which I listed first, and those primary ones, which I listed second. The reason I did it that way too is because the immediate sense of the worker is to think about those secondary needs. Because as a working class person, your sustainability already allows you somewhat to have some degree, some level of those primary necessities, living necessities. Now, for the poverty class, they're not the immediate class. They're the largest class. The largest class within the capitalist society is the working class. But they are definitely a class that is prominent, right? They are no doubt larger than the capitalist class, but undoubtedly they are smaller than the working class. And so their needs are always confined to that clothes, those clothes, food, electricity, and possibly shelter. So we understand that if capitalism and the capitalist class rejects the poverty class of this, well, then they start to die. We start to see population shrinks. We start to see declining populations, declining rates of, of stability within the population, where now there's less healthcare being provided to a even greater percentage of the population, which is already lacking healthcare. So this is just one issue with capitalism. How does socialism equate to this? Okay, so it's important to understand. As Marxists, we can only testify to the projects in history in which we have had. That means we look at the USSR, China, Cuba, to a degree Venezuela, and to a degree I would even say Vietnam, and some others can also be wrapped into this. Now, these projects that have historically existed were all aiming to achieve socialism, to achieve communism. They ever achieve these? Some might say yes, some might say no. But it is important to understand each of these given societies, the capital mode of production was still the prominent organized society. China today still operates in commodity production, but rather not just commodity production, but generalized commodity production. The only difference between the socialist states of the 20th century and the Western capitalist liberal democracies of today is the fact that they were state capitalist versus private capitalism. So the difference between these is although one was building socialist relations and the other was prominent with capitalist relations, they were both contented to the capitalist mode of production, which is confined to generalized commodity production. So, how does socialism equate to this? It's very important to understand. Socialism moves away from commodity production by now focusing on social production. Production not rather for commodity exchange through use value, exchange value, not that relation inherently, but rather the production for each according to their need, each according to their to each according to their own, to each according to their need, right? Which simply means we are now going to be socializing production based on what each person needs and how each person needs is going to be based on their social necessary labor time to produce the items and products that they need for consumption. Now, this is not to say that there won't be an overproduction of certain products, because within 1 hour of labor time, socially necessary over time, there will always, and there will usually be, an accidental cause of overproducing more than what you need as one individual. This is where the socialized production comes into play, where now when one worker overproduces what they need, they will only take the portion of what they need for their own survival, for their own suitable needs, and the rest will then be distributed socially to those who maybe need a little bit more of a help. So those who are disabled, those who aren't an immediate or aren't immediate working conditions, meaning that they could be students, they could be retirement people, they could even be workers who are struggling within their job because they may not have the skill set quite yet in order to fully embrace their job with its fullest potential. So, yes, there comes a skill set that is required. This is all acknowledged within labor theory of value, which allows for less less inequality, less inequity to be prominent. So this is how we combat this. So I've already covered now poverty. I've covered death. I feel like I will probably cover more on death in a little while. And I've now made the distinction between the socialist projects of the 20th century and the actual socialism of production. It is very important to understand when we look at the historical context for which Marxism arose, we also must look at the industrial capitalism of Sir Frederick Engels and Karl Marx's times, and understand that that industrial capitalism, that mom and pop capitalism, no longer exists. We now live in the most advanced financial banking era of capitalism, where capital interest is particularly intertwined within political capital and banking capital, which is then used for the expenditure of the gigification of the domestic economy and the imperializing of the abroad economy, or rather the global economy, where now American markets or American goods are being produced in abroad markets or forcefully being articulated through the expedition of imperializing, meaning extracting resources from other nations, with the goal of profiting the mega corporations and the capitalist classes which run these corporations to benefit them and to continue this active reserve army of labor, not just domestically, but internationally, globally. We understand a few of these corporations already to be things like Boeing, BlackRock, Vanguard. We can talk about the Rockefellers and their massive empire and industry that they have going on. We can even talk a little bit abroad, talk about Exxon and Chevron oil companies, which have been prominent and monopolizing over oil gigs around the entire world. I mean, OPEC alone is directly aiding Chevron and Exxon consistently. Why? Because oil money is the premise of all political exchange. Now, the deep state, the American deep state knows this. Hell, I mean, how many times do mainstream politicians even say it, right? is flat out the most profitable reason within the modern world. Why? Because it allows for military innovation, which is the basis for expanding military operations. I want to move on. There's one more argument that I think is really going to articulate just the kind of abstract nature of a capitalist mindset. And understand that liberals themselves are confined to only ever understanding capitalism and socialism through a very narrow lens. Before I go on to this, I want to flat out say, as Marxists, we should absolutely reject this notion of lesser equalism. Understanding that social democrats, left and on the left wing of the American political spectrum, are no better than fiscal Republicans and libertarians on the moderate right, right? They are equivalent, practically. The line that bridges them is very, very short, very, very thin. So going on to this, forgive me, going on to this, I want to combat the human nature argument. And I know that this is a common one. This is a common one that we tend to get into quite often. Okay, so going further into this, right? We need to understand the human nature argument not as something objective, but fundamentally abstract and subjective. When we understand human nature as a reflection of the material world around us, because remember, we are materialist, and therefore we do understand and interpret the world as primarily built up of material conditions, that cognition and consciousness, the mind and its subjectivities are only reflections of the material world around us, we then understand that human nature and that entire argument is a social phenomena. If we want to talk about the biology of human nature, we can get into that. But let's not make any vulgar arguments here, because we don't want to look at this in a mechanistic, binary way. We don't need to understand capitalism, socialism. We don't need to understand the world around us as black and white, as binary, because more often than not, the world is hardly ever binary. The world is full of grays and browns and so many other shades between black and white, between the ultraviolet spectrum of color that we are able to see. Hell, there is more often than not reality that's outside of the contemporary visuality of what humans see on a day-to-day basis. How can a system no more than 500 years old be human nature when even just 3 years ago, or 300 years ago, not 3 years ago, my bad, but just even 300 years ago, half the world was not even contended to this current socioeconomic system, where capitalism 300 years ago was considered foreign to the majority of the world and was only the prominent understanding of the most advanced sector of the world. I mean, hell, it wasn't even that long ago where feudalism expanded over most of Europe. And yes, most of Europe may entailed a semi-feudal agrarian economy. Nonetheless, the only true industrialized, developed capitalist economy existing were in Germany, France, and England. Other than that, the continental landmass of Europe, the majority of it, was very undermined, underdeveloped, and nowhere even near a fully encompassed generalized commodity production. I would still equate that I would honestly to this day say that the first industrial revolution that occurred, it occurred not through generalized commodity production, but petty commodity production. And that it was through the first industrial revolution during the Napoleonic era. So this is long before the 1800s. This dates back to the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon the Great, right? So and Alexander the First, right? So when we look at the first industrial revolution, this was the spark of the feudalism into a semi-feudal era, where proto-capitalist relations were building upon through petty commodity production. Petty commodity production, which was hyper-facilitated through the merchant classes and the guild and the guild apparatuses, right? Mercantilism first arises from this contrary. Mercantilism being feudalized, a feudalized market system, which still held to commodity exchange, just not generalized commodity exchange. Mercantilism differed very much from generalized commodity production in the sense that it was a zero-sum game, whereas everything within generalized commodity production is purely profit accumulation. This is how we understand the previous bargaining economy to the contending industrialization of the of the second and third industrial eras, right? So we now understand from that context that it's only been a relative short amount of time that for the majority of human history, capitalism has not existed. Hell, for the majority of human history, we did fit in to the perfect icon of stateless, classless, moneyless, right? We fit into primitive communism, a primitive society based on each according to their own, each according to their need, where it wasn't until the first incidences of primitive accumulation where classes were unintentionally created. But today, understanding that, we now have reached a technological advancement of the modern era to where when it does become the dominant relations within the social human relations that production is socialized, we will be able to prevent this. We will use cybernetics, automation. We will use input-output matrices. We will use AI planning. We will use some form of technological accelerants to be able to give humans human time, to be able to give people self-determination, to move beyond this understanding that we are purely in it for profit. I don't want to be rich. I don't want to hold billions of dollars and be unsatisfied, have zero social human relations. I want at the end of the day to be able to fully embrace this world and all that it has to offer, the joys and the encompassing mysteries that it has, and be able to do it at the fullest of my potential. You see, too often liberals and reformist social democrats will say the only way that you can change the system is by engaging in the system, understanding the system for what it is today. and that you have to come to terms with that. No, you can understand the system for what it is today and not come to terms with that. You can understand the system for what it is right now, and you can completely despise it. You can use that motivation to completely revolutionize, full on, at the face of capital accumulation and imperialism, destroy, deconstruct, threaten, challenge the system. Stop falling to this lesser evilism of voting for Democrats or Republicans because one party is the lesser evil than the other, and realize that both have fascistic elements within both of them. We understand as Marxists, right, that fascism, although fascism is more complex than the analysis that Trotsky and the others of the Soviet Union gave, it is important to understand, or that Kautsky understood, right? But it's important to understand that fascism is more. It is more than just the most crippled, terroristic, chauvinistic um, version of finance capital, and it is moreover the most concentrated form of banking and political capital as well, where imperialism becomes the normative, right? And that the, the welfare is used consistently to pacify the working class. The goal is, within fascism, to extendedly cut all welfare programs, to scapegoat, say that it is this group within society, it is their fault. It is their fault the world is the way it is, the society is the way it is. This is the moral dilemma of the state apparatus, in which Benito Mussolini himself even talks about within the doctrines of fascism, right? It is within the moral apparatus of the state that all matters are of state matters. That way, that no one person is away from the state, but that all men are matters of the state. So if fascism can convince people of this narrative, it can continue to cut welfare programs while continuing to build other welfare programs to pacify working class interest. This is it's a double-edged sword in a way, right? Where fascists will continue to cut the throat of social safety nets, to continue to exploit the working class, but then the working class will come to realization that their conditions are worsening. So to pacify the revolutionary potential of the working class, they give us welfare. Social democracy, or welfarism, is the moderate wing of fascism. And understanding that, we then understand that the most reactionaries, adversaries of fascism, are those of the collaborationist within the deep state, right? So these mean the capitalists who first-handedly aid and lobby interest within the both parties, so that they can continue to increase their profits to avoid the inevitable crisis that comes with the falling rates of profit. They will look for external profits outside of the traditional accumulation of capital, because at the end of the day, you are now being cut from your own labor. The capitalist realizes at some point in their goal to maximize their profits that by replacing you with technology, they inevitably cut their profits. And so what they do is they look for external forms of profit, justifying imperialism, national expansionism, colonial expansionism, and at whatever cost they may need in order to satisfy their profit gains. This is the most inhumane, most humanistic aspect of what capital and the capital mode of production itself entails. Anyways, so defending Marxism and anti-capitalist arguments, I think I have given a pretty nice rough draft of what it means to even engage or to understand Marxism. I will expand on on all of these points. I will continue to attack more capitalist arguments in another stream. So there will be a part to this one. This one was simply just to get the basic notions out there of what I'm trying to get across. And also, I was trying to get something out there, honestly, a little bit quickly, just because I was trying to not completely die out. And I know that this one probably won't get a whole lot of views, but at least I will remain active, continuing to posit my opinions. Again, I am rereading Capital Volume 1 right now. As I read through this book, I'm going to fully endure every single bit of information of capitalist political economy to further attack it. So, with that being said, I have no further discussion for the rest of today, for the rest of tonight. We are currently 40 minutes in, and I feel comfortable with the way that I have articulated. And I hope that if anybody within the audience has any questions, that they leave a comment, they reach out through Discord, Twitter, and or they just simply research and read Das Kapital for themselves. Again, what I am getting at is all within the framework of capital, because this is the most important work of Marx's time. Anyways, I have enjoyed this, but thank you guys all, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this stream. Good night.